Have you ever felt completely dizzy from the endless isms thrown around in the news or during historical debates? Well, you definitely aren't alone. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking on a massive challenge. We're going to demystify over 20 different political ideologies. Our goal right now is to cleanly, neutrally, and clearly map out exactly what these ideologies actually mean, where they come from, and how they relate to one another. Let's dive in.
To make sense of it all, we're breaking things down into 5 neat little buckets: foundations of modern politics, economics, ownership and control, movements for change, reimagining the state, and finally, the authoritarian extremes.
Starting right off with Section 1, Foundations of Modern Politics, or what I like to call the bedrock ideologies.
At the very core of modern society, there is this massive natural friction. On one side, you have conservatism. This is all about preserving the institutions that built society, things like the nuclear family, organized religion, the military, and strict property rights. But across from it, Progressivism. This is the belief that pushing forward and achieving societal progress is far more important than holding past heritage sacred. It's that classic tension between preserving what's been built and pushing for what could be.
Then we've got liberalism, and frankly, it's the dominant ideology of modern history. Why is it so dominant, you ask? Because it absolutely champions the individual. Free markets, multi-party elections, and massive personal freedoms, like freedom of speech and the press, form its backbone. It operates on the core belief that every single person has their own rights, everyone must be treated the same under the law, and that a government ultimately has to be approved by its people. But let's be real, where do most people actually sit? Usually, comfortably right in the middle, in moderatism. They float within what's called the Overton window, basically the safe zone of mainstream, politically acceptable policies. And honestly, many of them just prefer to live their everyday lives rather than take extreme stances. They might have a bit of political knowledge, but they generally just don't care to go out to the fringes. So that covers the basic rules of the game. But it leaves us staring down a massive, lingering question. Who actually controls the resources, the production, and the money? Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, Economics, Ownership, and Control. Think capitalism, socialism, and everything beyond. Here we have the opposing economic engines of our world. On the left, capitalism. This is driven by private ownership, free exchange, competition, and of course, profit. On the right, socialism, which is really an umbrella term advocating for worker-owned production, democratic self-management, and social ownership. In the modern age, that often translates to heavily taxing the wealthy to redistribute resources. So it essentially boils down to private profit versus social ownership. But these economic theories, they can evolve dramatically. The source material describes syndicalism as the son of socialism. Syndicalism actually aims to replace the central government entirely by unionizing the workforce and advancing demands through massive worker strikes. Now, if you push that evolution to its absolute limit, you reach communism, a stateless, classless, moneyless society where products are allocated purely based on need, completely abandoning the idea of private property. Now, I want to clear up a massive misconception right here. Corporatism does not mean rule by megacorporations. It's actually about organizing society by employment sector, think agriculture or engineering, to force structured, highly efficient cross-class negotiations. People are assigned based on their skills, and workers, employers, and the state negotiate with one another to run the economy as efficiently as possible. Moving right along to Section 3, Movements for Change, Identity, Nature, and the Masses. Beyond foundational economics, we have powerful movements that rise up to correct specific societal imbalances. Feminism fights for the total political, economic, and social equality of the sexes, actively dismantling gender stereotypes. Environmentalism demands that nature itself dictates public policy, focusing heavily on issues like decreasing emissions. And then there's egalitarianism, which acts as an umbrella, insisting on absolute social equality and equal treatment under the law for every single citizen. Then there's populism, and its golden rule is actually super simple. Give the masses exactly what they want. Because it thrives on dividing everyday people from the so-called elite, populism really has no permanent political loyalty. It's often entirely anti-establishment, inherently anti-politics, and it relies completely on the raw momentum of the crowd to drive its agenda. All these movements are constantly pushing the state to change. But what if the traditional state just isn't the answer at all? That thought leads us right into Section 4, Reimagining the State, Shrinking, Breaking, or Completely Bypassing It. Take libertarianism, for example. It shares liberal values like the basic rights to life, liberty, and property, but it makes human autonomy its ultimate god.
To achieve this, libertarianism demands that the government shrink down to its absolute bare minimum, stepping entirely out of the way of individual choice and maximizing political freedom.
Now, if you take that desire for a limited government and push it to its absolute logical extreme, you hit anarchism. This ideology wants to replace the state altogether. It relies solely on voluntary free associations in a society entirely without rulers or constituted authority. The entire focus here is on absolute, unfiltered freedom. Some ideologies just want to break things apart, though. Separatism aims to carve out a brand new sovereign nation right from an existing one. Meanwhile, republicanism specifically targets the crown, demanding an end to hereditary monarchs so that political power stays firmly in the hands of the citizens.
And that brings us to our final group, Section 5, the authoritarian extremes, absolute state control.
First up is imperialism. This is all about expanding a nation's power through sheer military force. Historically, expanding empires justified this kind of domination by claiming they were civilizing or providing resources to weaker nations that supposedly couldn't survive on their own.
When it comes to total state control, it really scales up in extremes. It starts with authoritarianism, a strong central power limiting civil freedoms and demanding strict obedience. Fascism weaponizes that structure by adding a dictator, heavy militarism, and demanding the individual sacrifice everything for the perceived good of the ultranationalist state. Nazism takes fascism and injects it with toxic Aryan racial supremacy and eugenics, which historically resulted in the horrific persecution and mass murder of those deemed subhuman.
But hey, what if this entire left versus right spectrum we've just mapped out is actually holding us back? That is the core argument of communitarianism. It claims that absolute individualism is actively harmful if it contradicts the common good, and that we must balance policies from both sides to truly serve the community as our primary social unit. And finally, looking way out into the future, we have transhumanism. I mean, why argue over government structures when we can just upgrade humanity itself? This ideology aims to bypass traditional politics entirely through technology, chasing immortality, advanced bodies, and incredibly highly developed minds to overcome our most basic human challenges.
So we've basically decoded everything from the foundational roots of conservatism to the stateless visions of anarchism, all the way to the wild sci-fi ambitions of transhumanism. With this mental map, you can decode almost any historical event or modern debate. So, from communitarianism to transhumanism, which ideology do you think will define our future? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.